the geopolitical.
What I'm wondering now is, going forward, what kind of empire the world needs the United States to be, and how the two candidates could possibly contribute to this.
There are very few eras in history where there are no empires. In fact, it's really, really hard to think of a century in which there isn't at least one, and usually more than one. Problem with the United States losing interest in the world and coming back home to focus on its own affairs is that leaves the field open to the other empires. If you go to Ukraine, I was there 5 weeks ago, you see a country that is being torn apart by an evil empire, which is the Russian Empire, which invaded in February 2022, committed multiple war crimes, and continues to wage a brutal war of attrition with regular attacks on civilian targets, direct attacks on schools, on hospitals, housing, in all parts of Ukraine. That's the problem with America's reticence, that it gives opportunities for those empires. And the same is true in the Middle East. What happened on October 7th, 2023 was that Iran gave a green light to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to launch what was in effect a trailer for the next Holocaust. And the Israeli Defense Forces were caught by surprise and hideous carnage ensued. The United States is a presence in Europe and in the Middle East. There are significant military forces in Western Europe, and not only in Western Europe, as well as in parts of the Middle East that go back to even before the war in Iraq. And yet, the role that the United States has played in the last few years has been a relatively weak one. Yes, there's been support for Ukraine, unquestionably. Financial support, military support. Although the Europeans have probably delivered somewhat more overall, the United States is still maybe 40% of the support for Ukraine. But it's not been sufficient for Ukraine to win its war. In fact, it's in the process of losing the war. And I think in the next 12 to 24 months, Ukraine will lose the war unless we change our strategy. Because right now, they're outmanned and they're outgunned. China, Iran, North Korea are supplying way more hardware to Russia than we are supplying to Ukraine. It's not a matter of incredibly complex military science to see that overwhelming superiority in artillery, in manpower, in tanks, in multiple rocket launching systems will lead to victory at some point, even if it's at quite a high cost to Russian grunts. So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem for Israel, democracy to which we've been committed historically since its birth, is that Iran is inching towards being a nuclear-armed power. But the theocracy in Tehran is committed to wiping Israel off the map. With nuclear weapons, it can do that. And the United States, although there's been rhetorical support for Israel since October 7th last year, hasn't really done that much to help Israel. Israel's had to fight Hamas in Gaza with a constant barrage of criticism from American, of course, and other foreign leaders. It has gone to war with Hezbollah and also with Iran with minimal support from the United States. And at this point, it feels as if Israel is pretty much fighting alone against Iran and its proxies. And it's hard to see how Israel can win that war in the sense of, say, destroying all of Iran's nuclear capabilities. I don't think Israel has the power to do that. So here we are in a situation where the United States is, on paper, the dominant power in the world with the most sophisticated weaponry, and yet it can't really make its force effective. Ukraine is on a path to defeat. Israel looks like it's fighting on its own. And if China imposes a blockade on Taiwan at some point in the next 4 years, what will the President of the United States do, whoever it is? They will confront a terrible dilemma. The dilemma will be of the following form. If the Chinese have blockaded Taiwan, the United States has an option under an act of Congress going back to 1979 to take military action. But what would that mean? Sinking Chinese ships in the Taiwan Strait? That wouldn't be a simple process that would stop in an afternoon. The Chinese wouldn't just turn around, sail home and say sorry. you would risk a rapidly escalating conflict of the sort that Jim Stavridis wrote about in his book 2034. You could end up with even a nuclear war in that scenario. The alternative is you just shrug your shoulders and say, sorry, Taiwan, but then China controls Taiwan, and that fundamentally alters the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific to China's advantage. And the Japanese and the South Koreans and others will look and say, well, that's the end of American primacy in the region. That's the dilemma. Or to put it differently, if we're in Cold War II and China's taken the place of the Soviet Union, in a Taiwan semiconductor crisis, we would be replaying the Cuban Missile Crisis, only we'd be the Soviets. Because in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we did blockade, and Khrushchev had to decide whether he was going to run the blockade with a naval force. He did. But then he blinked, and he really pulled back from World War III. We don't want to be in that situation. I don't think we want to be in the situation where we have to risk, as Khrushchev did, World War III over an island a long way away from us that the other superpower has blockaded. So I worry a lot about this particular period in our history when America feels a lot like Britain in the 1920s or 1930s. It's got these global responsibilities, but it's spread pretty thin. In a fiscal sense, its position is much worse than it was 20 years ago. I mean, the debt is now way above 100% of GDP. There's no prospect of a balanced budget. Debt service, the interest payments on the federal debt now exceed the defense budget for the first time in our history. And that violates Ferguson's law, which states that if you're spending more on interest payments than on defense, you won't be a great power for much longer. And that's a really concerning feature of our current predicament.